The moment the stagecoach wheels ground to a stop, the dust rose in heavy clouds around the little Montana settlement of Gray Bluff. The year was 1882, and the summer heat pressed down like a warning. Clara Wynn stepped down slowly, her worn boots meeting the dry earth as if touching a future she wasn't sure she belonged to. Her fingers tightened on the handle of her carpet bag. She had come here to marry a stranger whose face carried a scar folks whispered about, and she would not turn back now. A man stood near the hitching post, tall and steady, shoulders broad beneath a dark coat he wore despite the heat. A long scar ran from the corner of his left eye down to his jaw, pale and jagged against the dark stubble. His hat was pulled low, but his eyes, clear steel blue, found Clara the moment she stepped forward. "You, Clara Wynn?" His voice was low and calm, the kind that didn't bend. She swallowed. "Yes. I'm Mason Hart. We're set to marry." Clara had expected hesitation or discomfort, but he spoke as though reciting a fact. Nothing more, nothing less. She managed a small nod. "I know," she said. Mason turned toward a buckboard wagon tied to a deep-chested bay horse. "Long road to the ranch. Hope you don't mind dirt." Clara followed him, her heartbeat drumming. She had answered his letter months ago. Her father's debts had taken everything, except her determination to survive. Mason Hart had written plainly he needed a wife, someone steady, someone unafraid of scars. He had not promised affection. She had not asked for it. As the wagon jolted forward, Clara sat with her hands clasped tight, stealing glances at the man beside her. His hands were calloused but gentle on the reins. His profile was bold, the scar more striking than frightening. He caught her looking, but simply kept his eyes fixed on the road stretching toward the forested hills. When they reached his land, Clara felt her breath catch. The house stood tall and strong on a ridge, built of thick logs and stone. The porch wrapped around like a welcome she hadn't expected. A barn stood nearby, and fields widened out in every direction, gold and green under the sun. "You said you had land," she murmured. Mason nodded. "I do, all of it." Inside, the parlor smelled of pine, resin, and warmth. Mason showed her the room next to his, simple but clean, with white curtains and a quilt folded at the foot of the bed. They ate stew and bread in the small kitchen. Mason didn't talk much, but when she reached for the ladle, her hand brushed his. He drew back, almost too fast. "Sorry," he said quietly. Clara shook her head. "It's your ladle." "I think you're allowed." For the first time, something near a smile touched the corner of his mouth. The next morning, she woke to the smell of coffee and biscuits. Mason was already outside, chopping wood near the barn, shirt sleeves rolled high, muscles shifting with each swing. Clara watched from the window, wondering how he got that scar, wondering what kind of life she was stepping into. Later that week, she went into town for flour. The storekeeper, a round man named Alan, leaned close as he packed her parcel. "You're staying with Hart," he whispered. Clara nodded. "Yes." Alan's eyebrows lifted. "Well now, folks don't say it much, but he owns half this valley. Timber, stock, freight rights. Richest man around, though you wouldn't know it from the way he keeps to himself." Clara blinked. Mason had said nothing about wealth. He wrote to her like a man who owned only a roof and a fire. "He doesn't mention any of that," she said. "He hates fuss," Alan replied. "Always did." Clara walked home slow, dust lifting around her boots, a man who had so much yet carried himself like he had nothing to prove. Why her? Why anyone? That evening, Mason brought 2 tin mugs out to the porch. He handed her one and sat beside her without a word. The sunset washed the fields in orange. Clara breathed in the warm air. "You're not what I expected," she said softly. Mason looked at her. "What did you expect?" "A man colder, harder." His jaw shifted. "I used to be both." Clara studied him. "You still carry something heavy." He looked at her for a long moment. "War leaves marks deeper than skin." She nodded. "So does losing more than a man should." Their hands rested close on the bench, not touching. Almost. The evening wind brushed across them. "Maybe we understand each other more than most," Mason said. Days turned into a week. Clara baked bread, tended the small garden, and sewed new curtains. Mason repaired fences, fixed the roof, and brought her wildflowers. He left quietly on the counter. Sometimes she caught him watching her, and sometimes she let him. One evening, the storm rolled over the hills. Clara found Mason in the barn, calming a restless horse. She stepped inside, the air warm with hay and leather. "You have a gentle hand," she said softly. "So do you," Mason replied. The wind roared outside, but the barn felt still. Clara moved closer. Mason brushed a loose strand of hair from her cheek, his touch slow and careful. "I don't want to scare you," he whispered. "You never have." He leaned in, giving her time to move away. She didn't. Their lips met in a kiss that felt like two lonely hearts finding the same rhythm at last. The next morning, Clara found a small wooden box on the table. Inside lay a gold ring, simple and beautiful. When she looked up, Mason stood in the doorway. "We married on paper," he said quietly, "but if you want more than that now, I do too." Clara crossed the room, tears stinging her eyes. "I came here to marry a stranger with a scarred face," she said, "but I think I found a man worth loving." He touched his forehead to hers, breath warm. "Then let's start from there." The sun broke over the ridge in soft gold light, spilling across the kitchen floorboards as Clara dried her hands on her apron. Through the open doorway, she watched Mason in the yard as he saddled a chestnut mare, his movements quiet and sure. Each day she learned something new about him, not through words, but through the way he lingered in a room, the way he listened without interrupting, the way he treated the land like something alive. That afternoon, Mason brought a thick ledger into the kitchen and set it on the table. The leather was worn smooth at the corners. "I figure it's time you saw the accounts," he said. Clara blinked. "You want me to look at your books?" "I want you to know what's yours now." He pulled out a chair for her, "if you're willing." She wiped her hands and sat beside him. The columns were neat rows of numbers. Cattle sales, timber contracts, freight deals, equipment orders. Her father had kept ledgers too, though his told the slow collapse of a business drowning in debt. Mason's pages told a different story. A man who worked steady, who saved, who built without bragging. "You don't trust the banker to hold these?" she asked. Mason shook his head. "He has a fondness for cards and bad decisions." Clara looked at him. "And you trust me?" He met her eyes. "I trust the way you look straight at a person." Something warm loosened in her chest. Later that evening, Mason didn't head out to the barn after supper like he usually did. Instead, he placed a second chair on the porch and sat beside her. The sky burned orange and violet above the hills. A hawk circled high, its shadow gliding across the field. "A boy lived out here before me," Mason said suddenly, voice low. "His cabin burned in the spring of '69. Folks said his mother ran back inside to save him. Neither made it out." Clara's breath caught. "You built your house here?" "Maybe I wanted something to stand where something else fell," he said. She nodded. "That's a reason I understand." The next days moved with a quiet rhythm. A wagon came from town, carrying sacks of flour, bolts of cloth, and a cast-iron stove with polished handles. Mason had traded a load of timber for it. Clara ran her fingers along the smooth black surface. "You did this for me," she whispered. "You'd never ask," he said. "So I didn't wait for you to." She stepped close, hands still dusted with flour. "You keep trying to make this life easier for me." "I want it to feel like yours," Mason said, "not like you're visiting." "It does," she said softly. "More every day." A nearby couple from a small homestead visited that Sunday. The woman, a warm, talkative soul named Ada, brought blackberry preserves and asked Clara about her sewing, her pantry, her chickens. Mason spoke only when needed, but when Ada's husband asked about the freight route, Mason answered with quiet certainty, as if he knew every mile between Gray Bluff and the far towns beyond. After they left, Clara sat on the porch steps and exhaled. "You don't act like a man with more wealth than the town bank," she said. "No point acting like something," Mason said. "You either are or you're not." She lifted her gaze. "You could have chosen any woman from anywhere. Why me?" He held her eyes. "Your letters didn't try to turn me into someone else." Clara's throat tightened. "There's nothing about you I'd change." The weeks passed with new patterns. Clara kept the books, sorted the pantry, planted vegetables behind the house. Mason repaired the well pump, traded lumber for seed, built a bench beneath a tall cottonwood by the creek. They sat there one evening as the light faded. The night wind brushed her cheek. She leaned against him, and his arms settled around her back, strong and gentle. "Is there anything you miss from before?" she asked. Mason looked out at the darkening field. "Sometimes I miss not being scared of losing something." Clara turned to him, eyes soft. "You're not alone anymore." He touched her cheek with the back of his hand. "I know. That's why it scares me." She took his hand in both of hers and pressed it to her chest. "We'll hold what we have together," she whispered. His jaw eased. "Then we hold." That night, Mason didn't sleep in the room down the hall. He came to her bed quietly and lay beside her like he had always belonged there. The storm that rolled over the ridge after midnight rattled the windows, but neither of them stirred. The next morning, Clara walked the orchard behind the house, her apron filled with fallen apples. The September air had a sharp edge, leaves curling gold above her. Mason joined her with a pail in hand. "Thought I'd help," he said. "Frost's coming soon." They knelt together beneath the trees, sorting good fruit from bad. "You always lived out here alone?" she asked. "Since I came back from the war," he said. "Hired hands came and went. Couldn't stand the quiet." "And you could." "It was quieter inside me." Clara brushed her fingers over an apple skin. "It doesn't feel so quiet now." Mason looked at her. "No, it doesn't." That night the house smelled of apples simmering with vinegar and cloves. Mason carved a new axe handle at the table, each stroke precise. The fire glowed steady. "You ever miss where you lived before?" he asked. Clara shook her head. "Just a town full of saloons and people who turned their backs." "You had someone there?" "My father before everything fell apart. After that, no." Mason set down his knife. "You were worth more than how they treated you." Clara met his gaze. "You didn't know me then." "I didn't need to. I can see what you carry." Her chest tightened. "And you? Who did you lose?" He didn't answer at first. Then his voice came quiet. "My younger brother, 16, drank from a bad creek. I came home too late." Clara's eyes stung. She moved closer, her hand settling over his. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore," she whispered. "I know," he said. "You gave me room I didn't expect to find." The warmth between them deepened like a slow-burning fire. The carpenter came the next morning, a bent old man named Royce, to prepare the porch for winter. Clara brought him coffee and biscuits, listening to the hammering ring against the hills. "This house feels different," he said with a crooked smile. Clara laughed softly. "It knows I'm here now." Royce nodded. Wood remembers care. That night, Clara climbed the ladder to the barn loft where Mason was oiling saddle leather. She sat beside him in the warm smell of hay. "You ever think about what comes next?" she asked. "Used to only think about surviving winter," he said. "Now I think about planting more wheat." "And maybe a child," Clara whispered. "Someday." Mason turned to her, something tender in his eyes. "Someday." "Yes." Silence settled full and warm, not empty. Winter would come soon. But neither of them feared it now. Winter swept across Gray Bluff in slow, quiet waves. Snow settled on the rooftops, soft as breath, and the fields lay still beneath a white blanket that stretched to the tree line. Clara moved through the house with calm steadiness, her days marked by simmering stews, drying herbs, and the soft whir of wool spinning near the fire. The home felt fuller than it ever had, not with noise, but with warmth. Mason began building a cradle in the evenings. though neither of them had spoken aloud what they both hoped for. The smooth curve of the wood, the careful joints, the soft sanding, each piece was shaped with a tenderness Clara had not expected from a man who guarded his heart like a locked room. One morning, Clara found a folded note on the kitchen table held down by a stone from the creek. Mason's handwriting was steady. Went to the timberline. Back by dusk. She tucked the paper into her apron and stepped out to chop kindling. The axe bit through frozen wood, sending small chips flying. When she paused to catch her breath, she saw movement along the ridge, someone walking the fence line. Not Mason. Someone leaner, wrapped in a patched coat. By the time she reached the orchard, the man had stopped near the oldest apple tree. "You're Mrs. Hart?" he asked. His voice was rough, like he didn't use it often. "I am," Clara said, keeping her stance steady. The stranger nodded once. "Name's Aaron. I worked this land before Mason bought it. My mother's buried on the North Strip. Wanted to see if he'd consider selling it." Clara shook her head. "He won't, but you're welcome to warm up before you head out." Aaron hesitated, then followed her to the house. Inside, she poured him coffee in Mason's painting mug, the only clean tin. He sat with both hands wrapped around it, thawing slowly. "Folks talk about him," Aaron said quietly. "Say he don't speak much after the depot fire." Clara paused. "What fire?" "Freight yard outside Jackson. Caught fast. 5 men died. Mason dragged 2 out before the walls fell. Got that scar and half a burned coat to show for it." Clara gripped the counter, a slow ache rising in her chest. "He never told me," she said softly. Aaron shrugged. "Maybe he didn't want you looking at him like he was some kind of story." Clara's jaw tightened. "He's not a story. He's my husband." Aaron's eyes softened. "Then I'm glad he found you." By dusk, Mason returned with pine needles caught in his coat and a brace of rabbits over his shoulder. The moment he stepped onto the porch, he saw Clara's face. "Someone came by," she said. "I saw his tracks," Mason replied. "Aaron?" She nodded. "He told me about the fire." Mason went still, his breath sharp in the cold air. "I'm not asking you to explain," Clara said softly. "I just needed you to know I'm proud of you." His shoulders eased, but only a little. He stepped closer, cupping her face with a hand warm from his gloves. "I didn't tell you," he said, voice rough, "because I didn't want you looking at me like I was someone to pity." Clara leaned into his touch. "I look at you like the man I chose. That's all." He pulled her into his arms, holding her like he didn't intend to let go. That night he lay beside her, tracing the inside of her wrist with a slow fingertip. "The cradle's almost done," he murmured. "I wasn't sure if it was too soon." Clara placed her hand over his. "It isn't." The wind whispered against the window, but the room felt warm, steady, safe. When spring came, the thaw swept through the valley. Clara walked beside Mason through the fields, marking where he'd plant oats and where she'd grow squash and beans. He pointed to a small rise near the creek. "Thinking of putting a smokehouse here. And I'll need a bigger space for jars in the cellar," she said. Their plans unfolded easily, like threads weaving one cloth. Mason paused and gathered her hand into his. "I lived too long thinking survival was enough," he said, quietly. "You changed that." Clara looked up, her eyes soft as the warming sky. "We're not surviving anymore, Mason. We're building." He kissed her there by the creek, his hand steady at her back, the river rushing with meltwater beside them. Early summer brought the first blossoms. The orchard shimmered with pale petals, and Clara spent her days canning preserves and teaching children from nearby homesteads. Mason carved benches for her makeshift school, each one smoother than the last. On a warm evening in June, Mason stepped into the house, carrying something wrapped in oilcloth. Clara was near the hearth mending his shirt. "I made you something," he said, setting the bundle in her lap. She unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a book bound in soft leather, the pages blank and thick. On the first page he had written in careful letters, "For the stories you haven't told yet." Clara felt her eyes sting. She stood and wrapped her arms around him, pressing her cheek against his chest. "I never thought I'd love a quiet life," she whispered. Mason kissed the top of her head. "It's ours now." Years passed. The school moved to its own small cabin beside the orchard. Mason expanded the barn. Silver crept into his beard, and Clara traced it with fondness each night. They never had children of their own, but the house was never empty, filled with students, neighbors, laughter, and seasons that passed gently. One autumn evening they sat shoulder to shoulder on the porch, watching the leaves curl gold in the wind. The setting sun cast long shadows across the land they had built together. "You think we did things right?" Clara asked. Mason reached for her hand, his touch steady and sure. "We did it honest," he said. "And we did it ours." "That's better than right." Clara leaned against him, her heart full and quiet. And in the place where sorrow once lived, they had grown something strong, something warm, something true.